So thank you so much for joining, and a very warm welcome to you all. And welcome to our webinar, Scenario Planning, Predicting Possibilities and Managing Uncertainty. I'm Heather Rattray, part of the marketing team at Interface, and I'll be hosting this webinar alongside my colleague Howell Davies. And the webinar has been designed to help businesses kind of inspire thoughts around kind of recovery from COVID and beyond, with this session very much being around scenario planning, so thinking about the wider environment and how to think how your business fits into that and how to plan for the future. So we've got Professor Paul Hibbert, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews this morning, and he will share his expertise of using scenario planning as a necessary skill for predicting possibilities, managing changing business conditions. And while it may not be possible to predict what's going to happen post-COVID and what the world may look like, it is possible to try and plan for that and other environmental, social and political events in the future. So quickly, just to run through some housekeeping before we start, feel free to ask any questions using the chat function. That should show us a stream on the right-hand side, and we will come to those at the end of the session and run a Q&A between Paul and Howell. The webinar is being hosted and recorded. It'll be hosted online afterwards, so you will be able to catch up afterwards with all of the content, and we'll email all of that out afterwards. So now I'd like to hand over to Howell to introduce today's webinar and our speakers.
Thanks, Heather. Hi there. I'll just give you a very quick background on Interface and a bit of context as to how we got here, and then just get on to the main event, because I think we all want to really hear Paul speak and not me. So just are you on the Interface? So for those of you that aren't aware who Interface are, we're a free and impartial service. We're based regionally throughout Scotland, and we match businesses of all sizes and sectors with world-leading academic landscape we have on our doorstep. We have points of contact within each of the Scottish academic institutes that we put inquiries into, and what tends to happen is that actually sometimes the solution doesn't lie where you think it lies. It actually lies in another academic discipline, so we're quite unique in that way. If you move to the next slide, Heather, we've got a strong track record. We've literally this summer celebrated our 15th birthday. In that time, we've introduced over 3,300 businesses to academic partners, which is related to 2,400 projects. I really like this slide because you can see the sort of scattering of where the projects have happened. I think it's great, and it sort of shows that innovation has no sort of geographic boundaries. What we've also found is actually 70% of the projects are with companies and academic institutions in different regions as well. I think that's going to be even more so where people are working remotely, so much more. Next slide, please, Heather. We can also provide advice and support on a range of funding programs to help offset some of the costs for working with academia, such as the Innovation Voucher Funding Program here. I think it was last summer that we celebrated. I think they've gone through over 1,000 innovation vouchers now, which is incredible, really. So we administer these innovation vouchers, but they're actually funded through the Scottish Funding Council. And these schemes are really good for initial projects and almost that sort of dipping your toe in the water, working with academia and so on. Actually, I should say as well, because there's a few academic people on this conference as well, because we've got this huge database of sort of historic projects and introductions we've made. We've got a whole load of innovation-ready SMEs as well. So if you are looking to sort of build your consortia, or you're looking for help finding some of these industry contacts, we can possibly help you there as well. I'd also mention as well that you see we've got the Workforce Innovation Voucher. So this is in place really as, I suppose, an innovative review of how businesses work and maximizes its workforce effectiveness and productivity. Right, next slide, please, Heather. So I suppose since March, we've been running a series of webinars to help inform and inspire businesses in support of COVID-19. Some of these have been about that immediate recovery, things like, immersive content for promoting of businesses online, so with a focus on tourism, that was. But others have evolved into helping businesses look at how they change their business models and some of the behavioural aspects involved with that. I see this webinar as a progression, not just looking at recovery, but helping to future-proof your businesses as well. So just to give you a bit of context and how we've ended up here today with Paul, we've been supporting In-Game, which Paul will speak about as part of his presentation, on their R&D voucher scheme activities. And I reached out to some of my colleagues there to see who they could suggest in terms of academics to speak in our webinars. Hopefully we'll have one either later in the year or next year around gamification and gaming techniques and how they can be used in other sectors. But they recommended Paul, who's actually a co-director for In-Game. Some of Paul's slides will use the game sector as an example, but they're really relevant and can be applied across all sectors. And I see in our delegate list, there's quite a lot of you from food and drink, tourism, engineering, and third sector, which is fantastic. So that's really welcome. I suppose my own experience of scenario planning is more in contingency planning. When I worked in the food and drink sector, our customer insisted that we had certain contingency plans in place. For example, if our factory burnt down, when could we be supplying them with salmon again? Or there's an oil slick off Orkney, what would that mean? Where would we get our fish from? And so on like that. So that was probably a bit more operational. But, you know, it's just sort of, I suppose, my own personal examples from this. We will follow up after the webinar, but there may be potential to explore opportunities for businesses to work with groups of students at St Andrews as part of their fourth year projects after Christmas, but also as well, we can help you access other business schools and also wider universities. I'm just going to hand you over now to Paul, and I'll come back in on the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hal, for that introduction. And I'm now sharing my slides with you. Hopefully that's, Hal will give me the thumbs up, so I know you're seeing what I see. Terrific, thanks, Hal. So I'm going to take you into scenario thinking and scenario planning about how we think about handling unpredictable change. And as I do so, I want to highlight, this is really a taster session. I'm not perhaps going to address every nuance of this, certainly not in a short session like this, but I hope I'm going to pique your interest, show you some of the relevance of this technique, and also show how you can use insights from these kinds of studies to stimulate your own strategic thinking and planning in your own organisations. So my agenda is, first of all, to mention In-Game, as Hal has mentioned briefly, take you through scenario thinking as a process. It's important to understand really how it works and fits together before we can talk about what we do with the insights that comes from it. I'll talk about application of scenario thinking to the games and media sector. That's really focusing on our work In-Game. But as you'll see, lots of the driving forces and changes we look at in the future in that sector are relevant to many others. So I hope it'll stimulate your own thinking too around those kinds of issues. I'm going to also go into what I'm calling scenario thinking light, which sounds dreadful, I don't know why I call it that, which is how to use aspects of a future-oriented approach in our strategic conversation to have some more resilience and readiness for some of these dramatic shifts that can occur and how we can handle that. So In-Game is part of the AHRC's Creative Clusters Initiative. It's a large, about 80 million funded programme of innovative work across clusters around the UK. And In-Game is the Games and Media Enterprise cluster centred on Dundee and involves the partners you see there. And it's about delivering research and R&D support to services for games and media companies in Dundee and also in the region beyond. And that really connecting internationally too, because the games industry isn't entirely localised, you won't be surprised to hear. So that's who we are. And what the cluster organisation In-Game does is help experimentation in the cluster, to help people to take risks in a carefully managed way, develop resilience across the cluster so that the workforce is supported, so that the skills that are developed across there have some enduring space and time in the region, and help overall innovation to develop across the region and beyond. That's what we do. And so we're interested in scenario thinking because that helps us to think about lots of those things in a related way. It helps us to think about risk, responsiveness and resilience. And it's useful not just for us, as I've highlighted already, but for all sectors, because the nature of scenario planning, it generates general pictures that can be applied flexibly, although it's generally oriented towards a particular client's interest. I'll make this make sense for you in a moment. So why do I think it's a worthwhile technique? So here's a scenario written in 2012 that I was working with a student group at St Andrews who were doing forward planning for the DCA, the Dundee Centre for Contemporary Arts, and they were writing in 2012. And you can see on the right of this slide, they had included in one of their potential scenarios a worldwide flu pandemic that led to approximately 75,000 deaths in the UK alone. Now, they were a year too early at 2019. It was the flu, not a SARS type illness, but they had anticipated that kind of possibility. And what I want to highlight, this isn't just random speculation on their part. They were basing their thoughts on evidence and reports. There are plenty of evidence in 2012 that in the next 10 years, a pandemic could be expected. And that's why some people have been disappointed at the level of planning around the world in those countries that took it in different ways. So it is possible to not predict, but be aware of the extreme possibilities that can come to face us. And some of these stories have utility in helping us to adapt our thinking and our positioning to be able to do so. So how can we see those extreme possibilities coming up? My advice, best of all, is to use scenario thinking, but that's using mobilized evidence. We use trends, projections, analyst reports, and also, importantly, skillful judgment in diverse teams. So the way in which people from different life experiences and positions understand how these things connect is important in the process. Focus should be counterintuitively on those things that are least likely. If we try and predict the wild possibilities of the future, it does no good to think about the central trends. So we can think about population steadily growing. We think about climate change in the long term. It's quite predictable effects now. But what we can't be certain of are these switching events. Like you think about what might happen if the US election in just a few days now is Biden or Trump. The world will be quite different depending on that. And if we were trying to predict that a few years back, we'd be even less certain what was going on, although we're still not very much certain now. So it's finding these turning points of unpredictability that help us to see how the extremes might play out. So if we start from that perspective of looking for the unpredictabilities, we can be aware that scenario thinking can help us because they give us plausible views of how the environment might develop in the future. So it's not going to give us one picture, but multiple pictures showing the way in which things can go. So we use environmental influences, things that we can't change as organizational experts, but which have a high level of uncertainty. And we want to be able to explore what ifs around those possibilities. So in that frame, scenarios are an imaginative, generative way of using evidence and debated opinion amongst people like yourselves who have a good feeling for your industries and your contexts to shape how we interact with possible futures. It's about really resilience no matter what happens, not about being absolutely precise about the future. So scenarios therefore are not actually about predicting the future exactly, certainly not. They are not about seeing all possible futures, one of which will be right. So I showed you a scenario earlier from an analysis in 2012 that turned out to be a close fit to how the world turned out. It isn't always so. What it does instead is give you a feel for the extreme range that you have to operate within. And that's what we're really looking for. So a good way of using this imaginative evidence, excuse me, let me start that one again. They're a good way of using evidence imaginatively, using our own insights creatively, and seeing how things may develop in the future, and to be ready for that, whatever happens, even if it looks very different to our current lives. So as an example of that, you can look at the responses, not in New Zealand, which has been a special case, but in Taiwan, around the way they handled the COVID epidemic. They were very well prepared for it because of earlier experience in their case, but people have responded differently. We can see the way in which there was resilience and robustness in different places that we could learn from. And what we're trying to do with scenario thinking is not to do with the current circumstance, but be ready for the next one. And the way in which that works is to think of our context of our organization in 3 levels. We're used to thinking of our organization's internal environment, the bullseye, the focus, where we're busy the whole time. And we know what's going on there. We know how to be efficient and effective in our own processes. It gets a bit more complicated in the transactional environment which surrounds us. These are the people we play games with, not in a literal sense, but we interact with in complex ways in terms of people like customers, stakeholders, suppliers, government, all the people who are having influence on our internal environment. And beyond that, in the contextual environment, these very unpredictable things we can't control, major shifts in large-scale government, climate change effects, unpredictable diseases. And when we look at how we guide our organisation. One way is to start from the inside out, looking at our organisation's resources, capabilities, what we can do and what we've got to offer. And we're generally very good at that. And the other way is to look from the outside in. What's acting on us that we can't control and how must we respond? And that's where scenario thinking is really helpful. So scenario thinking then is a process to help you understand this briefly. And some of you I know from your job titles and experience will have some experience with this already, but just quickly, it's a way of using our outlook on the future by getting this evidence together that includes more predictable elements, which can be predetermined factors. So let's say, for example, we know that population generally will increase, we know that, but less predictable elements, like we don't know which way the precise way the next Westminster government elections will go in a few years' time. We can't really call that right now. If you look at the opinion polls, they're roughly level between the Conservative and Labour Party. That's a good indicator of something quite unpredictable. When we combine those, it's the unpredictable elements that really make an impact together with those constant factors. And we can look at the possibilities to build up a number of alternative pictures that shows the range, the space within which we might have to operate in the future. So it's not about pinpointing the future, but it could be from this range to that range. And you're probably used to that already in terms of some of your own contingency planning, let's say around single factors, like you will have some thought and awareness of how to run your business or your academic organisation if interest rates are high or low, if inflation is above or below a certain level. These are things you will plan for. What scenario thinking is trying to do is trying to bring all these imponderables together and give you a neat way of seeing those pictures and operating your business in any of those contexts where all the factors and variables are playing together. So how do we build up our scenario pictures to use this kind of analysis? We start with good evidence. So we start with PESTEL. That's a way of characterizing external evidence. What it means is we look for factors and evidence related to political, environmental, societal, technological, economic, and legal factors. There are other acronyms you will have seen. Perhaps there's STEEPLE and just basic PEST, and a whole other ways of ranking. It's just really a way of gathering evidence and predictions about what we might expect in the future, so we can get this evidence together and see how it interacts. From that, we identify key driving forces. Now, these are real imponderables that will cause or influence other change quite significantly. So a good example right now would be the US election. There's rumour stroke news reports that Boris Johnson is waiting to see which way the US election goes before he takes a harder or softer line, relatively speaking, on concluding negotiations about an EU trade treaty. So you can see already from that one factor linked to another factor, a whole other set of things will fall out. So knowing which of these factors are important is really helpful. So to do that, we prioritise them. We look at our factors like an election outcome with an impact uncertainty matrix, and we're trying to find the ones that have a lot of impact, that are really uncertain, that will shape potential future directions. So the two key driving forces help to build up a matrix. We frame and scope stories around that, and then we tell a story of what the future looks like in that position so that we can interact with it. So we're trying to use our imagination to see how we might live in those potential futures with more resilience and robustness than if we didn't try and explore it now. How do we get to those key driving forces, those major interacting factors? Well, we look at these potentially disruptive events and outcomes that radically shape the future. I've given you an example already with the American election and how that could already link to a number of other factors right now. But normally scenario thinking is looking further in the future where the imponderables are more massive and more numerous and more complicated. So we normally look at scenario thinking as a minimum of 3 years, but normally 5 or 10 years will be typical planning. In the oil industry, they've used scenario planning in 20-year or 50-year timeframes. The biggest time frame I ever looked at with an organisation was 50 years. They were somebody who'd been around for hundreds of years, so they thought they could look at that time frame. But normally, no less than 3 years, and normally 5 or 10, but that doesn't mean it has no relevance before then. If you build a picture of how you get to 3 years, you can see what's happening along the way. So the story tells us how to interact along the way of these possibilities. So it doesn't just say now and in 3 years, it's about the timeline between. So think about the facts that may have driven contributed to these things. We'll give you an example of those disruptive events. So what contributed to 9/11, to Brexit, to COVID-19, And we can think about various factors, political factors, and some of these things aren't always what we expect. They can be not economic factors, they can be social behavioural factors, or cultural factors may be important sometimes. So you've got COVID-19, we can link to food habits very directly in one particular location. But they may be perceptions of different cultures, and maybe education aspirations, social movements, for example, around the Occupy movement, if you remember that, and particularly the people working against climate protests right now. So these things will also have an impact. So don't just look at the economic factors is my guiding light here, really, because we're very good at knowing those. We're very good at working with interest rates and inflation factors and these kinds of things, but it's the social changes sometimes that are unpredictable. Anyway, we find the unpredictable factors wherever they are, and we locate those most disruptive ones in the way I talked about. We set up a matrix where we map out these factors. So we'll have election results, we'll have interest rates, we'll have unpredictable disease factors, maybe the emergence of a vaccine or not when that happens. And in that framework, there are things that are important to us once we map those things out. So the things that are most certain are not irrelevant. If you have something that's very certain and has impact, like a shift in climate change in the long term, for example, that features in every future story. That tells us something that's going to be there no matter what, and we should pay attention to it. But also there are these disruptive shaping factors at the bottom of the diagram there that are least predictable, most uncertain, and still have impact. So election results are the classic one I always give here, but things like a new disease occurring. Don't forget, this isn't necessarily, and I hate to say this, the last new disease we'll ever encounter. The fact this has happened is a pattern that's shown itself repeatedly with SARS and MERS, and this is the latest one. So we need to get better at handling the unpredictability of new diseases, not just dealing with the current one. But let's park that thought for a moment, just to emphasize that disruptive factors we've seen in the past don't necessarily go away. They can come back. So that's how we find them. And we're interested most of all in shaping how we understand the future by looking at that bottom right corner of the disruptive shaping factors that give us some idea of what might change radically. And we think about impact in several ways. So we can think about how those factors impact. Can be something that impacts on us directly. So for example, if there's a trade deal with the EU or there isn't, that will impact on lots of us on this webinar right now, very directly in our daily lives, in our business lives. So we can think about that impacting us directly. Indirectly impact on key stakeholders of the organization. So does it impact on our customers, for example, or our students or our clients or our suppliers, but not us, in which case the impact reaches us, or the impact on everyone. So the fit here are things like a disease epidemic, impacts on everyone, including our organization. But when we look at scenario work, we're interested on what our organization or our sector experiences. So though we're telling a general story, we want to see how we're living in it. And that's going to be important when I show you the examples from in-game scenarios. I'm talking about our life in these futures, but there are factors there that are relevant for everyone too, as we'll see. So certainty, uncertainty, these, just to reiterate that again, these are where two extreme outcomes seem equally plausible. Let's look at the American election again. At the moment, it's showing 88% likelihood of Biden on the latest analyst reports, but it's really pretty touch and go in some states. It's a toss-up, and it's within the 2% margin in lots of them. So where things look equally plausible, that's the uncertainty we're trying to find. Again, like the UK election in, is it 4 years' time now, in the Westminster election, with the current party standings are equal, we really can't predict which outcome it will be, which colour the government will take at that point. So that's something really uncertain, will have a high impact. That will figure in our bottom right corner. So impact for uncertain is whether you care which way it goes. So does it make a difference to you whether it's Biden or Trump? For most of us, it probably will make a difference in the long term, so we care about that. But other things it might not. An election that's unpredictable in, I'm trying not to do any injustice to another country here, but an election unpredictable, let's say in Eastern Europe might not impact us directly, but it's still unpredictable. We don't feel the effect of that so much. But certain force the impact of the overwhelmingly likely outcome. So climate change, things are predictable now. We're not changing things quickly enough. So we have to start preparing for some of those adaptations now. So they matter no matter what the other futures are talking about. So we get those two factors from these key dimensions that are really uncertain, have a high impact from our perspective, and are not correlated. So we don't want to get, for example, a highly unpredictable tax rate and a highly unpredictable inflation rate, because those are both governed and managed in a correlated way. So we're trying to look for things that aren't connected, because they was the most shape to explore, and then use those to shape a matrix to define scenario possibilities. Now, at the moment, this process might seem very confusing. It's difficult to go through it once and slowly and to sell it to you completely, but I'm hoping that I show you some of the ways in which the stories play it will start to pull together and make sense. So a basic scenario design, as I've talked about, finding that bottom right corner where things are very uncertain, have a lot of impact on us. And then from that, we build up 4 different scenario stories. So let's say our 2 factors we're using here might be another epidemic, and there might be the outcome of the UK election in 4 years' time, neither of which is predictable in that time frame, both of which will have a dramatic impact on us and our organisations in the future. So it's worthwhile thinking about what might lead up to those outcomes, because that's also going to have an impact on us. So we use that to shape our scenarios, and then use other uncertain factors that are relevant. So if you were thinking in classic terms about, for example, fiscal policy and UK government stances, then you could generally connect certain fiscal policy directions with certain government outcomes. You could locate other uncertain factors against the ones you do know once you know them. And the relatively certain factors fill in the story as well. So I expect to see climate change appearing in every long-term story. And then we try and link things up using logic to build up a chronology of events from the evidence we've got across all these other factors. How does that look when we do it? Well, I'm going to show you some examples from the games sector to help you see what that looks like and to begin to make sense of it. But I want to explain why in this focus on the games sector, we've focused on 2023. That really is about as short as you can make these things, a 3-year timescale. But the games sector is relatively fast moving, and relatively short timescales can make sense because the underlying technologies and consumer habits can change quite fast. So it does make sense to look at short timescale for that industry, whereas if you're looking at others, it might not. But factors affecting the sector still point to issues in that time frame that may affect many others. That's why I'm focusing in that particular way. And here's what the mess looks like halfway through, okay? So we've taken our key factors that we're looking at. We're looking at COVID-19 treatments being available or not in a short term. Short term here means within a year or so. And linking up several factors into current business resilience. So I can't unpack that for you right now, but we looked at several related factors and tried to pull them together in a cluster. Sometimes you see things that are unpredictable that make sense together, and so you cluster them up. But from that, you can start to build a picture of what the outcomes are if there are unresilient businesses and no COVID treatment. I think we can start to pick out some things we might expect to see in terms of unemployment, business outcomes, sectoral shifts, and so on, for example. So we build up a map of our factors like that and start to bullet point the storylines. And I'm going to pick up 2 of those storylines now from that process to help show you what we get from the output of this process. So looking at Game Set 2023, here's the 2 extreme scenarios I'm going to take you through. And normally we give these a name, and that's not just idle creativity, that's to help us talk about them in conversation. So when you are working together in a team or across a sectoral group talking about, oh, this looks like a path of thorns scenario, you have an immediate mental map of the factors under there without having to go again through them in detail. So it's a way of shorthand way of understanding. We do this all the time, actually, when we relate to historical circumstances. So we're doing it the same way for future circumstances. So we might look at some of the current unrest around the UK and saying it's looking like a Thatcher government time, that sort of thing, about the unrest in the north. So we have ways of shortcutting our understanding and bundling these things up. And that's why we use these titles. As I said, it's not just idle creativity. So in this particular scenario, we show a record recession from lockdown. So far, that's looking like the truth. Complications from lockdown, such as a cleanup of certain systems. We've got a backlog of medical issues. We've got disruption in the economy, social unrest, other health issues occurring. That's some of these already you can see is emerging now trends. A no deal Brexit is consistent with this. That's part of the business resilience factors we had there. So in this scenario, there has been a no deal Brexit. That's how we think about it. That's why it starred. Vaccine widely available early 2022. That's looking like the realistic early time frame for global wide availability. That's what we mean by widely available. It may be available in some countries and some parts of some countries much earlier than that, but globally and for everyone, 2022 is our optimism. 20% shrinkage in the games sector, but accelerate esports trend and selected international partnerships. So we see some threats for our industry. That's, I'm putting the industry specific here, stuff at the bottom. But we see also from the cultural patterns changing, already we can see trends about the way in which different kinds of business might be possible, and select international partnerships are growing stronger already. So again, with a no-deal Brexit, that's quite consistent. So you'd expect to see stronger partnerships where the UK government can make them, but they're going to be patchy. So it's really placing your bets on where those partnerships will be. That's going to be important for all of us involved in international trade in any way. So that's the relevance of that one. Scenario 2 is our less optimistic scenario, in which there's a vaccine or effective treatment is not available. This is sadly still a possibility that current vaccine predictions may be that predictions are the vaccines may be no more than 50% effective, but nobody knows how effective they'll be in the long term, or whether the virus will mutate, or whether something else happens. And I hate to be pessimistic, but part of scenario thinking involves handling the pessimism and seeing what we do anyway. So, but neither scenario is more likely from our perspective at this time. We still have a record recession though. I talked about some things being relatively certain in scenarios, no matter what happened, because the effect of the lockdowns is already in place. There already is the record recession playing out, and there's no reason that's going to be undermined anytime soon. So that's the example of where one of these factors becomes predictable and we play it out in all scenarios. If there isn't a vaccine or effective treatment, it's likely that in this scenario, we saw also there'd been a Brexit deal because situations were so hard that the vaccine not being on the horizon, the UK government would likely to continue to maintain some partnership with Europe because it's just necessary in such a weak position, however you think about Brexit. Business will be co-opted in generative response to the crisis. What we think has shown, the UK government has shown in its habits, is that it wants to look for commercial solutions and commercial input. So if the crisis continues in the long term, there'll be an increased look towards business to find solutions and be engaged in that. And also reliance on technological solutions. We can see that happening now, and the fact that we're having this webinar is indicative of the kind of thing we see happening, and advances that we find bring us a convenience that there's no reason to go back from. Lots of the time I'm having online meetings now, for example, I can see I would never need to do that face-to-face again, and it's made certain things possible. So we will rely more on technological solutions in this outcome. We'll have to, because the disease prevalence is difficult to contain. But also there'll be significant growth in the games sector, looking back to our own interests now, by 2023, core business and diversification opportunities, because the technologies that we have in games for virtualization and interacting at a distance become increasingly important across a wide range of sectors. So I hope in those two quick run-throughs of scenarios, you can see some things that could be relevant to you, no matter what sector you're in. If I go back to the previous one, for example, we've got this record recession happening no matter what. We've got some complications from lockdown and social unrest that may or may not happen. So being prepared, for example, for social unrest is important. You are, all of you, I know, thinking and worrying what to do with Brexit. To be honest with you, I don't think a deal is going to look dramatically different from a no deal in some ways, but it's still going to be significantly different in terms of our planning and the paperwork we have to handle. So that's already on your radar, I know. But the vaccine unpredictability is important. So being ready for either of those circumstances and thinking about the impact on our own sector of these effects as we look at the more pessimistic solution as well. I'm thinking also of optimism and pessimism. If the situation is as bad as it can be, what do we have? What's our creating our generative response that could make some difference to this situation? And sometimes an opportunity presents itself that way. So even in the worst circumstances, we can together find our creativity being useful and finding a way through. So that's how we can maybe reflect on the stories that we've got for the in-game's own interest and how it relates to other sectors. But there's a key difference here that I want to highlight for you, and it's getting to these key differences. This is sometimes the most helpful thing we can do scenario work. It gives this shortcut to thinking strategically again that's so helpful. So if there's a vaccine arrives in a reasonable time, we foresaw in our scenario planning, the group at in-game that worked on this, an embrace of physical life. I think at the moment, I don't know how you feel, but most people desperately want to get back to the old normal. We have no interest in a new normal. We want to get back to meeting people, movement without restriction, being able to travel. And so interest in virtual technologies may wane in the short term after the vaccine arrives, although some niches might survive. So people already are interested in esports, and that's growing, and the current conditions have given that a boost, but people are kind of into it, so that we can see that continuing. And similarly, as I've talked about already, some of the business optimization that comes from using virtual technology is not going to go away either. We can see people will do that still in the future. But if vaccine is not feasible, there's an embrace of tech solutions. We are all going to change our behaviors. That's the important thing. And some of us have done that already, I think, in terms of our attitudes to travel, talking to people and colleagues across different sectors. Some people who are very committed to travel, both for personal reasons and for their business, don't see that as being important in the same way, or desirable, actually, because it also answers other issues in the long term, like climate change, but also they just see other solutions as being more helpful and resilient. So this is a key difference for me between the way the world is shaping at the moment, a return to the embrace of physical life or an embrace of tech solutions. And maybe those two facts are playing out right now, and we can't predict which way the balance will go entirely, but having those two things in mind and thinking about how we adapt to either one of them is perhaps important. So pulling out some of the factors from those two scenarios again for you, thinking about the relevance for other sectors besides the games industry, and just to really reinforce the fact that these exercises are targeted towards a particular industry's interest, but they are useful reflection nonetheless, because of the wide outside-in scope that they have. So in our Path of Thorn scenario, we saw the impact of recession and social unrest. And I think putting those two things together is really important. We've had social unrest in the past. We've been on the edge of it already in the current COVID crisis. So I think part of my future planning in any sector will be to consider what the effects are on my organisation if there is significant social unrest. And you can see it happening in other countries already at different stages in the crisis. So thinking how that impacts on us is an important thing to think about. Thinking about trade partnerships, I said these can go one of two ways. It could look like more like the current situation, but with increased complexity and difficulty, or we may be looking at a situation with limited trade partnerships and strengthened connections among these. So if I was concerned with international trade, I'd be looking at where are the UK government's hit lists, what's my exposure or benefit to those places, and particularly watching the US election to see how I am hedging my bets around that. So thinking about where the trade partnerships may fall, paying close attention to that, and shifting some of my focus if possible is something to think about, but not overcommitting to that right now, but being aware that may need to be done. Thinking about consumer behaviour shifts. So on the one hand, being ready to go back to the old normal, but technological efficiencies will be attractive. So let's say I'm working in tourism, I want to have people back in my hotel in the normal way and enjoying the wonderful experiences in Scotland, of course, but might people want to have a virtual room tour or a virtual tour of the particular locale? Might they want to be able to check in with you in different ways? Now they know they can do that kind of thing. So there's still some technological efficiencies and benefits that may be attracted to us. And of course, back office things and business meetings, I think, should be changed forever by this experience. In our more negative scenario, maybe we don't have the social unrest, but you still got the recession. So maybe you can interact with people in different ways. You're not exposed to negative public opinion if you're seen to be on the winning side or losing side so much. So you can play the recession differently and think about how you interact with the possibilities and challenges differently. Permanent need for technological and logistic shifts still in this situation. So although the positive outcome from the current crisis leaves us with the chance to exploit and benefit from some of the gains we've developed through adaptation, how do we build on that really much more radically if there's a permanent shift? So that's an important thing to think about. Also, I think one of the things worth thinking about anyway is what do we do if there's a radical reduction in international movements in the long term? So, for example, if you are thinking about the tourism sector, and sorry to pick on the tourism sector, it's heavily affected. I know that you're all thinking about this really very seriously. and people are focusing towards more local travel generally, or thinking about transport corridors and building up those partnerships. But if international travel is less frequent, how can we make the benefits available to people into longer term visits maybe that happen less frequently? So restructuring what's meant by an international tour might be something to think about. I don't have all the answers there, but just showing you how even these scenarios developed in other sectors have things that are relevant to all of us that can show some benefit from our current reflection. The big so what from all of these things, though, for me, is what can we do anyway from the work I've shown you so far, is the embrace of technological solutions for life and business that's already possible. So if there is a benefit that we've gained from patterns of working at home, meetings at a distance, why would we stop doing it? So what's going to remain anyway, and how do we adapt to that circumstance is really important. And thinking about how those trends and tech events change your sector is something that has to be taken and contextualized by you in your own sector, of course. You know your industries and businesses for the experts that you are, and the academics present will also have the same feeling about universities and the structure that we have in those. So think about how they change your own sector is part of your adaptation of this thinking. But also there's some other thinking you can do if you don't go through the targeted scenario planning process yourself. You can use these kinds of ideas to inform your strategic conversation anyway. So if you can't run a full workshop and generate these pictures for yourself, you have options to use other people's scenario thinking, like I've been trying to share with you today, or you can look for a handful of key unpredictable outcomes and think about how you play with those ideas. So what does it mean to you, for example, the vaccine development is vaccines available in 1 year or 2 year? I think that's the window realistically for full implementation if a vaccine is robust. Well, how do the different election results influence you? And start thinking how you play back from those referendum and trade results. We may be facing another independence referendum if the Scottish Government election goes the way it's predicted to. Hot and cold wars between trading nations as well, all possible. So I encourage you to have speculative conversations about these unpredictables and think about how they affect different factors in your context, and think about how you might then be able to adapt to those or be exposed to them in ways that you are not currently ready for and what you might do. But not to place your bets on any one of them, thinking how can we be resilient and adaptable? If you're doing that, it's much better to talk through this with a team, and a team which has diverse opinions. So it's, of course there should be a difference of opinion when we're trying to predict different futures, because no one knows. It's where you want the insights and the kind of intuitive expertise of your colleagues to come into play at this time. When you do that, and you've thought about those different things, ask how people are living differently in those circumstances. Ask how we're living differently in these key imponderables come to pass for us, and how our customers or suppliers are also interacting in those circumstances. And then what might we then do? So it's a generative and speculative process. It's much easier to do this around some fully developed scenarios. So I do encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to work with students at St Andrews if you get the chance to get some scenarios developed for your own sectors. And do them on a sectoral basis, I think is a good idea. But you can still have this conversation about these imponderables and think about your resilience and robustness in any case, and come to a decision about what you might then do. Some final thoughts before we come to our chance for discussion and questions from you in the chat window. I'm happy to pick up issues and answer them the best I can. Final thoughts are then, your strategic conversation should include more possibilities than your public strategy. Of course, you want to have a key way forward if you're a sector organisation, if you're a public sector supporting industry, if you are in an academic context trying to plan for the future, you will have a way forward, and that has to take a kind of a position around the mean and the most likely things from your perspective, but your conversation should be entertaining all kinds of imponderables. And perhaps that's happened to all of us anyway, as we've thought about, well, what if this happens, what if that happens? We're doing that, but try and think it through to its conclusions and what the impacts are and how you might adapt. So have some resilient plans in play, and to do that around scenario thinking if you have the opportunity to build up scenario stories for your own sector. I keep reinforcing this point every time I talk about this kind of thing. Don't assume it all comes down to economics. In the long term, culture and social shifts are more decisive. And sometimes those are aided and abetted by infrastructure systems we didn't predict. So for example, in US politics, the shift towards populism and the success of the previous Trump election campaign is really associated with a shift also in social media, Facebook and Twitter, that has automated algorithms that tend to give you more of the same. So if you sign up to a conspiracy theory Twitter stream or Facebook thing, it gives you more of that. You get more of that same media. If you sign up to Democrat focused sites, or if you focus on liberal positions, it tends to give you more of that. So the media has had an impact on polarized social opinion and groupings. And so the interplay of these factors around cultural and social shifts are also important. So it's not all economics, although in the past it used to be the case that we'd say if the government in power is doing well with the economy, then they will stay in power. It's not true anymore. There are different shifts in play. I would say also in around your strategic conversation, thinking about playing with ideas of the future and how you adapt, be creative, but we're not all creative. We're not all people who like working stories and imponderables. Work with others who can, if that's not your strength, and it's perfectly okay if it's not. If you're a rational analyst, maybe you need to work with other people who are more creative and generative to give yourself some space to play with these ideas. That's my recommendation to you. I'm very happy to have some questions and discussion with you, and I'll stop sharing my screen to help that happen.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that was so insightful, with hopefully lots of tools that people could take away and use and kind of adapt to their own business from the examples that you've given. So yeah, very practical session there with lots to think about. So we have had a couple of questions come in that I will just pull up just now. Okay. So we've got one with regarding, I think, kind of long-term and short-term, and just thinking about kind of, I guess, these brain drain signals on post-COVID and looking at long-term or long-form content. Does that continue to perform better than short-term business? And how do we seize that?
I'm sorry, not sure. What was the content aspect of that, Heather? I didn't.
It was around the long-form content continuing to perform better than short-form in business.
I think that's a possibility. I'm thinking what that means in your own particular business is that something to be worked out in your own sector. So I think, yeah, that's an imponderable one. So I was thinking about this earlier, actually, when I was trying to think about how I might play with these ideas of other sectors. So thinking about, this isn't exactly the answer to this question, but thinking about long form further than short form means different things in different sectors. But I was thinking, what if there was a new kind of holiday that you took every 2 years if circumstances didn't improve, that included a week of quarantine, then 5 weeks of absolute freedom? And who would sign up to that now? If that's the way it would work, I would absolutely buy it. You know, my long form content for tourism is to secure a Scottish island, have quarantine just off the island, then you have 5 weeks on that island living absolute freedom. How does that sound? So, yeah, I think it's a good question. So shaping our experiences and our consumption of content differently may be one way of doing that. So repackaging, reorienting what our offering is to different time frames and different circumstances. Another way of looking at it would be, how might we have a micro experience? People already do this, for example, in tourism, where they have, you can get the hotel spa products at home. Maybe you can get the bathrobe and the spa products, and here's the scented candle. I don't live like that, by the way, or at least I'm not going to admit that I do. But you know, you can see how both possibilities give you ways of adapting. And I think it's a really good question to play around with that kind of idea.
Great, thanks, Paul. Another one that we've got come in is that when it comes to business and scenario planning, we may call something to be disruption. But if we agree on everything being the continuum of evolution and disruption, it may not be the appropriate buzzword. So I guess, do you have a thought on what would be the right strategy, if not determination?
That's a very complicated question.
Keeping you on your toes first thing on a Tuesday.
Yes, oh, goodness me. Well, thank you for the intellectual workout. I know, I really appreciate it.
You're probably noticing I'm staying quiet at this point.
I could just ask Howell, but no, won't that be unfair? So I think it's a good way to think about it. I mean, people often think about business structures punctuated equilibrium. So there is generally an evolution in business, and then there are disruptive elements. And we see disruptive change brought about either by circumstance or entrepreneurs. So I think we do have to think about disruption. I don't think there is a gradual evolution and adaptation. recent history has not looked like that. There may be circumstances and periods in history when the more gradual evolutionary path seems to be developing. So if we look at the computer industry, we can see an evolution in processor power. This is Moore's law, isn't it? The rate at which computer processing improves. So some of those things are predictable, but overall, I think you need to think in both terms, and that's really what scenario does. Scenario thinking does. He says some things are predictable and change in a way you can understand, and some things aren't. So it's not one or the other. Actually, it's thinking with both frames and their interplay between them.
Great, thank you. We've had somebody else just comment to say that they would buy that holiday, Paul. So
oh, terrific! Just start my company now.
And another question here, more of a statement, and I think you might have covered this in a couple of your final slides, but is it not pessimistic to look at the worst case scenario, and is it better to debate above all the plan?
It is pessimistic, but don't forget I include also an optimistic scenario, although it was so bad it didn't look optimistic. But optimistic means the best you can realistically hope for in this case. It doesn't mean what you'd really like to happen that isn't plausible. So it's the best plausible and worst plausible outcome. So the idea is to be ready for anything. In our own planning, for example, all of us perhaps put some money away in our pension, our savings, not knowing whether we'll need those savings or not, but knowing we have unpredictable things. There might be a leak in the roof, the car tire might explode. These things might happen together. You know, we plan for some worst possible outcomes, even if we hope not to have to use them. It's our resilience, and sometimes preparing for those things makes us tougher anyway. So I think you have to entertain the worst possible circumstance so you can be ready for all the things in between that. So if you're ready for the leak in your roof and the car tire to explode the same day, you're ready for either, if you see what I mean. So if you entertain the worst, you're ready for everything. But if the worst is so bad that you can't operate in it, it doesn't do you any good to think about it. Perhaps that's where the question's going. So if the worst is absolute economic meltdown across the country, it does no good to think about that. But I don't think plausible outcomes look like that. They look very tough and they require hard thinking of us. But I think it helps to think about them, but balance it with the opposite. The important thing is your business ready, or your operation, your organization ready to provide support when things are as good as they can be and when they're as bad as they can be, because you have to operate whatever the circumstance is. So it's knowing that space and range and being resilient for it.
Oh, sorry, I just had a thought. So like the whiskey sector, where you think that they're working 10, 15, 20 years ahead, or they're laying down whiskey now for that. Do they take a different approach, or how would they go about this? Do they just have to future-proof things by making sure they have cash flow and the rest of it? Now, how would you, if you worked with a distillery, how would you sort of scenario plan for them?
Yeah, I haven't done work with the distillery sector for some time, although I have done in the past when I was a management consultant. But I would say they actually got more than one answer, because the whiskey sector is complex. So you have investment whiskey, so that is almost like gold as a commodity. So you can bank that away as a kind of reserve commodity. So I think some of the 50-year-old whiskies will sell for tens of thousands of pounds, if not more. So you have the investment sector, but then you have the commodity sector that depends on current consumer behaviour and trends. And so I would say I would look at it if I was in the whiskey sector, balancing my portfolio, which I think the whiskey sector does. So I've got the super luxury investment brand that's more reliable. Sadly, the one truth that seems to be happening through this pandemic, that has been for a long time, is the rich people still keep getting richer. So if you play to the top end, you've still got some customers. But what happens to your base load custom? So how do you play the one part of your business against the other to adapt through that, I think is the way I'd look at that. Does that make sense, Howell?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's just one of these. I remember talking to a director of a whiskey company, and he was saying we just have to think, we're laying these things down for 20 years' time, because I might not even be working here at that point, but a very different mindset.
Yeah, so that's the point, that individual changes for people in the organisation will come and go, but the resilience of the industry is different. So I think looking at the long-term survivability of industries is different than the way the sector is impacted in the short term. But yeah, for us in academia, actually, it's a time of contraction. But I think in the long term, the require for academic provision is not going away. So it's the same kind of thing.
Paul, just taking into account kind of, I guess, the current circumstances around COVID, are you getting a feeling for how often, I guess, businesses and companies are using scenario planning? Is it becoming more commonplace practice?
It's becoming increasingly common, I think, especially in those industries I've talked about already, where long-term planning is essential. So if you're digging oil wells, you have to be prepared for long-term shifts because the investment is so long-term. It's always been popular there. The difficulty is in sectors where people see their changes happening more rapidly and they don't see the relevance of longer-term planning. But I think it's becoming more popular, but I think at the moment it's not front of people's mind because they're dealing with current crises. But I hope from some of the examples I used today that I can show that even thinking of views in the future can show how that can help us to deal with the current crisis resiliently and be adaptable to which way it might go. So I'm hoping that it is becoming more popular, but increasingly, I think people right now, people are just in a panic mode, and that's not unfair. They should be that.
I think added to that, I think there's someone from Visit Scotland actually on this webinar, but I've noticed the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, they've been putting out their strategy or their plan. I noticed they've been using scenario planning within that, which is music to the ears. And I think we've spoken as well about looking at particular sectors, obviously food and drink, that's the COVID thing, but there's also Brexit at the moment. What does that mean? What are the implications for the supply chains?
Yeah, I think this is a key role for sector industries and business support agencies, for sector organisations, business support agencies to show some leadership there and bring people together to develop scenarios around these things, because it really is something that affects the whole industry rather than one player, and it's something that affects them equally. And so it's a universal benefit to the sector to have some idea of how things might play out.
And so that diagram you had where the bullseye one, is it quite effective to sometimes have people from the outside coming in to help form these scenarios then? Yes,
and in fact, one of the founders of scenario thinking, Kees van der Heijden, used to talk about requisite diversity in a scenario planning team. And his requisite diversity when he's working for organisations like Shell, that's where the planning started actually in industry, was with Shell. And he worked there for a long time in their long-term planning. He would bring in to the scenario planning team people like opera singers or novelists, because they just have a different creative way of looking at things that all of us focused on our rational daily lives don't do. And sometimes you need that creative disruption to open up how things might connect differently. Novelists and creative writers are brilliant. I always think, whenever you think about the future, the poets get there first. If you ever want to trust me on that, and read E.M. Forster's short story, The Machine Stops, and how that looks like the modern world. It's written about 1919, I think, but it sounds just like the modern world. The poets always get there first. That's my final thought, perhaps.
Thanks, Paul. Just to finish off, we have had one question come in, just around any potential software tools that I guess anyone that's been on the call or people can use to support scenario planning and how they might go about that.
No, I don't use software tools for it. Some people use things like spreadsheets to do the ranking for impact uncertainty. I normally do a messy, interactive human process because I want to get the intuition out from a diverse team. It's something that would be very amenable to bespoke software if somebody wants to invest in developing that. But I think it's where I really value the interactive element. And so the real struggle for me in producing the scenarios in games, we have to do it through these media. Without being in the messy room around the whiteboard, and that took some extra effort. So I can see why the questions come up, and it would be handy. But I think you need to try and somehow maintain that human interaction, that spark of creativity that comes when you're getting different voices coming around the same shared picture.
Great. Well, I'm aware that we've gone slightly past the hour, so I will bring the session to an end. But I thank you so much for joining us today, Paul, and kind of sharing your areas of expertise. And I think, as I said before, it's given everyone quite a lot to think about and very relevant for every business sector, especially through the times that we're working within, whether that's with COVID or with Brexit, and as you said, kind of upcoming elections, whether that's in this country or out with, and the impact that has. So I'd just like to say that with Paul being here from his academic background and the role that Interface plays with working with businesses and connecting into academic expertise like Paul, the universities are open to business. They are open to support businesses and help that recovery and rebuilding from the impacts of COVID and beyond. And Interface are here and happy to make those connections. So if you would like to connect with Paul, or if you feel that you've got any other business challenges that you think that Interface could help support, the details are here on screen. You can visit our website or contact us via email, which is listed there. But I hope today's session has been useful